I almost didn't unmute myself. What's new? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Regener8d Radio, episode... What is this? Episode 3 of season 3. I know I'm never gonna get that right on the first try, but it's good to see you guys tonight. There's a few of you guys already hanging out in chat, and I appreciate that. For those of you who are tuning in on Spotify later on, do know that this is something that we record. I've been doing it live now. I had moved from live to recorded, and now we're back to live, and I've really been enjoying doing that, and people have been enjoying asking questions and things like that. So really have enjoyed it, and I hope you guys will join me live. I would give you a time, but I can't give you a time because sometimes it's like 9:30 at night, like now, and sometimes it's more like 4 in the afternoon. And so just keep on the lookout on Twitter and all the socials and everything for what time we do the live recordings, but definitely jump in because it's a lot of fun to be able to interact with the guests and ask questions. So a couple of quick notes of housekeeping before we really jump into everything. First and foremost, if you're on YouTube right now, we're really close to 250 subscribers. We'd love to hit that milestone just for the sake of it. Eventually, if you get to 1,000, there's a lot of things that open up, so I do want to get there eventually. So definitely, if you're listening, you're watching this, click the subscribe button. It really does help me out, and the like button if you get a chance. A couple of other quick things. We do have a couple of new ways of getting in touch with me. One of them is through Instagram. I did set up a new Instagram account called Regener8d Radio. You might notice the socials. That's not on this scene, but you might notice the socials of rotations changed, and that's in there now. So definitely check that Instagram account out. I'm posting some, quotes and clips from the podcast and things like that on there, as well as designs from the store. And so if you don't notice, if you haven't seen yet, if you're on YouTube, you can see that I'm wearing my Regener8d Radio shirt that I got in last week. Really love these shirts. They come from Spring, and they've done a great job with the screen printing. So definitely check those out. I've had a few people order them, and I know they're starting to get shipped out to people. So I'm excited to show some of those things to you guys. Really quickly, I'll give you a quick preview. If you are on the YouTube channel, you can kind of see the links to all this, of course, is down in the description, and you can see that I've got several different designs on here. It's not just for my podcast. I'm doing this as more of a kind of confessional Baptist apparel in general. So I've been really enjoying coming up with the designs. I've made all these myself, even though I'm not really that great of a graphic designer, but it's been a lot of fun. So hopefully you guys can check out that store. And if you like anything, then support. There's more than just shirts. There's mugs, there's stickers, and all sorts of stuff. So enough plugs. I hate talking about myself. So let's talk about, instead, who we have on the podcast with us today. And that is Mr. Garrett Walden. Garrett, I appreciate you joining me. How are you doing tonight? Yeah, well, Garrett's here. Garrett's going to help us to work through the first of what should be a series of episodes called Baptist Profiles, where we take a historic Baptist and we just talk about who they were, their lives, their effects on the church at the time, their effects on what we can learn from them now and today. So we're going to talk with Garrett about that just a little bit, and we'll do that in a moment. Before we jump into the conversation, though, I want to pray for us. So let me go ahead and do that. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you that we can come together from a long distance apart, and we can have fun conversations and learn a little bit more about people that we wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity to do so. Lord, I thank you for Garrett. I thank you for his work. I thank you that he's been able to unearth things about a more obscure Baptist minister that we would really be able to learn from. God, I pray that we would learn from him tonight. God, we thank you again for your son, Jesus, who died on the cross for us. And it's in his holy name we pray. Amen. Whoop, I messed up my scene there. All right, so before we jump in, I'm just all over the place with my scenes tonight, so my apologies. Before we jump in, Garrett, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit more about who you are. Plug yourself a little bit. Hype yourself up. Oh, and hold on, I have you muted. Okay, there we go.
All right, well, I may not be my best hype man, but let me first say my name is Garrett Walden. I'm from Alabama. I'm married to my wife, Kat, short for Catherine, and we've got 4 kids. Henry is 6 years old. Eleanor is 4. Phoebe is 2, and Louise is 9 months old. So that keeps us pretty busy, but there's some other things too about that. I'm a pastor of a church. It's called Grace Heritage Church here in Auburn, Alabama. And so I'm really grateful to be a pastor there. Wonderful people. They love our family, and we love them, and really grateful to be part of the church there. Short version of how I came to be here. I was raised in a wonderful Christian home. I was taught the gospel at a young age and was converted and baptized, and came to college and really grew a lot. And that's kind of when a lot of my theological convictions began to solidify in college. And Shortly after that, went to seminary up in Louisville, Kentucky, to Southern Seminary.
The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, right?
Right, it's the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so grateful to have had a wonderful time there for my MDiv. And kind of midway through that, I moved back to Auburn, became kind of a pastoral intern at Grace Heritage. And in God's kindness, that turned into a calling to be an elder. And so I finished my MDiv from a distance here in Auburn. And the Lord opened an opportunity, a door for me to be a PhD student there. So I'm living in Auburn as a pastor, and grateful to do that. And I also am working on some doctoral research at Southern Seminary under the supervision of Dr. Michael Haken. He's just a wonderful scholar and Christian gentleman. So I learned a lot from him, and he's published a ton of books and a ton of articles, and he's really quite prolific. And so that's kind of how I got into John Ryland, and that's kind of where I am in my research.
Okay. Well, that's great. So I know I do want to jump right into John Ryland in a minute, but a couple of quick things. I know that you don't just do your doctoral work. You're involved with another group that we love here on Regener8d Radio, the London Lyceum. You want to talk about anything about what you do with them?
Sure. Yeah. I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah. The London Lyceum is a wonderful kind of collection of people that focus on Baptist theology and history, confessionalism. So specifically holding to the historic Reformed confessions of faith, and analytic philosophy and analytic theology. So it's kind of an interesting combination of interests that I have. And it's just a wonderful group of people that I've really gotten to know over the course of the last couple of years, and grateful to be a part of it. We've got a website, we've got a podcast. Maybe some of your listeners are familiar with the podcast already, but my particular role, I'm the book review editor for the website. And we've had some great book reviews and a lot of other good content that comes out on the website that I basically just get a chance to read it ahead of time, and sometimes offer some suggestions for making it stronger or clearer. Sometimes, we have great authors and great writers that contribute to the thing. I'm just kind of grateful to be part of it, and really thankful for Jordan and Brandon, who kind of head up the podcast front.
Yeah, Jordan will actually be joining us in about a month from now. We're going to talk about analytic theology, which is something that I've briefly been exposed to now, but I'm not super familiar with it, to be perfectly honest with you. But I keep telling Jordan now, we've been talking a little bit on Twitter, I keep telling him as soon as we have that episode, then he's going to have to stop calling London Lyceum the only confessional Baptist analytic podcast, because now I'll be that too. No, I'm just kidding. But that's good. It's going to be a fun episode, and I'm excited to have him as well. Definitely check out the London Lyceum. I know Garrett just put out a book review on Jesus and John Wayne, I believe. So, or was that you? Or was that somebody else? Or was that just
that kind of got scrapped.
I thought I read that.
There was an article that came out about historiography that got a lot of traction, and so
gotcha.
We decided to kind of go a few different directions.
Okay, well, excuse me, my gaffe.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
But regardless, definitely check out the website, London Lyceum, thelondonlyceum.com. If you don't put the "the" there, it won't get you there. So, but yes, definitely check that out. Good people over there. All right, well, Garrett, now we can jump into... I told Garrett I just wanted to have him on so that he could just have a chance to just gush about John Ryland, because he talks about him all the time on Twitter, and his wife makes fun of him because it's all he ever talks about. It's fun, so I figured let's platform Garrett and give him a chance to do what he wants to do. So, Garrett, why don't you introduce us to this figure, John Collett Ryland, and kind of give us a brief bio of his life.
Okay, this is the moment I've been waiting for. So
it's your whole life just flashing before your eyes here.
So September 30th, 1785. Imagine yourself there. There are these pastors who are gathered in a room in Northamptonshire. This is the Northamptonshire Baptist Association. They're gathered for this annual kind of regular ministerial meeting for the pastors think of it kind of like a county. And so one of the older pastors in the room asks two of the younger guys to suggest a topic for them to talk about. And it's here the 24-year-old William Carey, just kind of 2 months into his pastorate at the Baptist Church in Moulton, William Carey suggests that they talk about the command in Matthew 28:19 to make disciples of all the nations. And he's basically asking this question: does that apply to the church in all ages, or is that a command that is only applicable to the apostles? So that's what William Carey asks. This older leading pastor was apparently not what he expected. So he speaks from his chair. He says, "Sit down, young man. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do it without your aid or mine."
Wow.
And that man is John Collett Ryland. And so if anybody has ever heard the name of John Collett Ryland, it's probably only in that context. So I'm going to guess most people, if they're familiar at all with the story of William Carey, you've heard that. You probably haven't heard the name Ryland, but that's him. So he's the guy that rebukes the father of modern missions, and it's really that kind of brands him for all posterity as kind of the frigid hyper-Calvinist that kind of was opposed to missions. And so this is kind of the story that kind of got me interested in John Ryland, and that led me to kind of study a little bit more about that scene. It's actually quite complicated. It's a lot more complex than it might initially appear. And so I may come back to this in a little bit, but there's some competing recountings of that story. What exactly did happen in that room? Did John Ryland really say that? There are a couple of different versions of what was said. There are kind of different streams of memory about who said what and when and for what purpose. And so that's kind of the story of John Ryland that gets told. So part of my purpose is to study more about the man, to try to understand him in his own context, to understand him in his own words, and kind of assess the situation. And so ultimately, I think he has been really misrepresented. So, for instance, in that particular scene with William Carey, I think he does say something discouraging to William Carey. But in my study, I have concluded that I think he was probably being sarcastic. As weird as that sounds.
You can't catch those things through these historic stories very well. So it's interesting. Yeah. How do you come to that conclusion?
So there's some interesting kind of people that pass the story on, and there are some people that really don't like some of the stuff that's happening with the Baptist Missionary Society, and so there's some. It seems like there might be some biases about how the story gets told and how certain characters get portrayed in that narrative. And so kind of looking at who's saying what about who, I was able to kind of uncover a little bit of that history. In particular, there's one early biographer of Ryland who says that very thing. He says that the thing was intended to be ironical. And so someone who was kind of nearer to the place and time, who knew a little bit more about what was going on, says that it seems like it was probably some like dramatic and somewhat theatrical moment. He was trying to like make a point about something, and it probably wasn't necessarily his just this kind of really cold-hearted hyper-Calvinism. So again, my purpose kind of in some of my study has been to understand Ryland more. And so let me tell you a little bit about his life and just some of the dates and significant times. So he was born in 1723 at Burton on the Water in Gloucestershire. He was converted in 1741 under the ministry of Benjamin Bedham. And so he was converted, kind of in the early 1740s. Not long after that, Benjamin Bedham commissions him to go to study at Bristol Baptist Academy. And so under the tutelage of Bernard Foskett, Ryland gets kind of a theological education. He had a terrible time there. He was a super ambitious student. He was kind of a feisty personality. He kind of has some waves of up and downs of maybe like depression. And he had this really serious internal wrestling about the deity of Christ, about the existence of God. So this is kind of the age of reason, and rationalism and deism are super popular in England at the time. And so Ryland really went through a spiritual dark place while he was in what we would probably call Bible college or seminary. And so Through the 1740s, he's there. He gets called to be a pastor at the church in Warwick, and he's a pastor there for several years. He gets eventually called to be the pastor in Northampton, and that's where he was for most of his ministry. So he was in Northampton starting in 1759, and he's there for like 26 years until 1785.
Now,
and he kind of retires.
Sorry, Northampton sounds really familiar. Is that who else is from there?
So Jonathan Edwards is a pastor in Northampton in New England. Yeah.
Okay, that's why.
So Edwards kind of makes a cameo in the Ryland story as well. And I may come back to this a little bit later, but so Edwards was, of course, super influential on both sides of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
John Collett Ryland is a reader of Edwards, and Ryland publishes Edwards' sermon on the glory of Christ, or the excellencies of Christ. He's the first person in England that we know of who publishes that sermon, and so it goes on to make an impact. And so Ryland was a fan of Edwards. Edwards is in Northampton in New England. Ryland is in Northampton in Old England.
Gotcha. Okay. I was going to say, it sounds familiar, but it didn't. I think the Atlantic crossing didn't register in my mind well.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So you may wonder, like, why do I keep saying John Collett Ryland? He has a son, John Ryland Jr. So let me tell you a little bit about his family. He got married to a woman named Elizabeth in 1748. They have 5 children ultimately. John Ryland Jr. Is super influential. John Ryland Jr. becomes best friends with William Carey and Andrew Fuller and John Sutcliffe and Samuel Pierce, basically these kind of pillars of the Baptist Missionary Society that send William Carey out. So John Ryland Jr. is a really big deal in 18th century and early 19th century kind of Baptist development there. So this is John Ryland Jr.'s father that I'm interested in. And so it's such an interesting connection, some of the stuff that Ryland Jr. did. So he also has another son named James. I mentioned maybe his daughter Elizabeth, another daughter Rebecca. He's got another son, which I think is interesting, whose name is Herman Whitsius Ryland. And so he named his son after Herman Whitsius, one of the great kind of post-Reformation Reformed guys. And so what's interesting is John Ryland Jr. names one of his sons Jonathan Edwards Ryland. So some people have kind of shown this interesting contrast of kind of some theological differences between father and son, John Ryland Sr. and John Ryland Jr. So it's kind of just an interesting family. The whole family is interesting, going back generations prior to Ryland Sr. and then generations following Ryland Jr. So a whole interesting thing. He eventually retires in 1785. He moves to Enfield near London, and he dies in 1792. So he's active in ministry for like the last half of the 18th century. And during that time, he publishes literally thousands of pages of theology, thousands of pages. One of the reasons he retired from the church in Northampton is because he pretty much went bankrupt. Every penny he had, he spent on books and getting his own stuff published and getting the stuff of other people published. He reprinted a bunch of different stuff that other people had written. He's just, at some point it's kind of admirable because it's like, he's so interested in getting all this good material out there in the world. And I think by most standards, we would say it's probably unwise. So a lot of critics of Ryland have basically considered it kind of financial indiscretion. It gets kind of awkward at one point. He's friends with John Newton. And so John Newton is also friends with Ryland Jr. Ryland Jr. is super upset about his father's financial indiscretion and is super embarrassed about it. So John Ryland Jr. writes to John Newton and says, "What am I going to do about my father? He is basically embarrassing the family name. He's spent himself into debt, and he's probably disqualified from ministry." John Newton says to Ryland Jr., "You need to help your father. You need to pay his debts." And so John Ryland Jr. pledges a significant portion of his own salary to help pay his father's way out of debt.
Wow. And
at great cost and embarrassment. There's another time where Ryland Sr. is he's kind of feisty, and he says things and he gets himself in trouble. And at one point, he says some things that are pretty outlandish. We don't know all the details about what it is. Ryland Jr. again writes to John Newton and says, my father is really, he's lost at this time. I think I need to publicly, in print, oppose him. And John Newton says, do not publicly rebuke and oppose your father. He says it would be better for you to be abandoned from the kingdom of God than to oppose your father in public. And so John Newton is like this voice of reason and wise counsel to John Ryland Jr. And so John Ryland Sr., what makes him so interesting to me is he has this totally unpredictability in his personal life. I don't think he does things that are like grossly immoral, but he's just so eccentric. Eccentric is the word that comes up in almost everybody that writes about him. All of his friends, people that are like a degree or two removed, They always talk about his eccentricity. So it just makes him super interesting to me. So that's a little bit about who he is. It
sounds like a bit of an object lesson for us guys who are surrounded by books and maybe spending I literally on your recommendation, Garrett, I literally went and bought a book from Jim Hamilton on typology like 10 minutes ago. So I might get in trouble for that one, but it was 40% off. It was 40% off, guys. If you ever
free.
Exactly. If your wives ever, this is the trick. If your wives ever ask you how much did you spend on that, you just say it was 40% off. You get off scot-free. Yeah. Anyway, so that's good. That's good bio. Is there anything else you wanted to add about sort of a brief sketch of his life before we move on to some theological concerns?
No, I think that probably covers it. There's really been only one significant work on his life. There was another work that kind of treats him a little bit. So there's not been much written about him, and so that's part of some of the stuff I'm working on is writing a more formal biography for him.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently. Mostly because I've been listening to some of the things you've said on Twitter about this guy, and I'm like, if I had to focus, like hyper focus on one person, I feel like it would be hard to choose in the sort of era that we live in, where everyone has been written about and everyone has. But you can find guys like this who only have one or two books written about them, or even if that. That's
yeah. So that's exactly what happened with me. I was talking on the phone with Dr. Haken, and I was basically trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And just totally off the top of his head, he listed out maybe a dozen people from the 18th century. He's like, here are a dozen people that basically have nothing done on them, that someone needs to do this work. And so he listed off all those names. And the only name I could remember was John Collett Ryland. And so I just Googled him and I found some interesting stuff, some PDFs of stuff that got scanned in, and started reading. I'm like, this is my guy. I'm gonna be a Ryland guy. And so sometimes you just need somebody to tell you, like, hey, you're looking for an open lane. Here's an open lane, and there's no competition. Yeah. Just do your thing. That's how I came into Ryland.
Nice. Okay, cool. So now we know a little bit more about who he was, how you came into studying him. I think you mentioned that he wrote over 1,000 pages, I guess, of theology over the course of his life. So clearly he was pretty articulate. He had a lot to say about theology. So what are some of the sort of theological contributions that he had for us to kind of analyze today?
Yeah. So when I say thousands of pages, I still haven't uncovered all the works that he's written. He's probably written well over 100 unique works. Some of them are things that he has taken from other authors and had reprinted. Some of them are his own original compositions. So he seriously he was quite prolific in his day and was a really big deal in his day, very, very respected. So one theological contribution that he makes, I'll give you a few, but one is in the communion controversy. So during the late 17th century, middle of the 18th century, there was a communion controversy in Baptist life, specifically in the particular Baptist world. In the kind of previous iteration of that controversy, it was like John Bunyan versus William Kiffin. And it was about who can come to the Lord's Supper in a Baptist church. Some Baptist churches would say only professing believers who have been baptized by immersion as a believer. There were others, and other Baptists like Bunyan, who would say, no, anybody can come to the Lord's Supper. And the baptism by immersion thing doesn't need to be a reason to bar someone from the Lord's Supper. And so that was going on between Kiffin and Bunyan in the 1670s. It kind of gets revived in the middle of the 18th century, and then in the 1770s it gets brought back up again, and Ryland's involved in it this time. There's a pamphlet by Candidus and Pacificus. There's these two pseudonyms, which really is John Ryland and Daniel Turner.
Okay.
And so what probably ends up happening, there's a great article by Lon Graham on this. I believe it's Lon Graham, where basically I think what happens is Ryland writes this pamphlet about defending the open communion position that basically says we should not make baptism by immersion a criteria for the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. Daniel Turner takes Ryland's stuff and edits it and maybe adds a little bit, adjusts a little bit, and then Daniel Turner publishes it, and it gets some pretty broad traction and kind of re-sparks this debate. So he ends up being pretty influential in that debate, but kind of through a pseudonym. So I think that's an interesting debate. It later gets kind of picked up by Abraham Booth, and Andrew Fuller kind of chimes in. Well, kind of indirectly. Robert Hall Jr. chimes in on it in a little bit later than that. So it ends up being kind of a hot button issue in its day, and Ryland's in there. So, but one of the main issues that we've got to wrestle with John Ryland and his theology is the issue of hyper-Calvinism.
Yeah, you've said a couple of things so far that kind of have hinted at the fact that there could be a little bit of an issue there. So expand.
Yeah. So ultimately, I think the evidence is mixed, but I think it leans toward him not being a hyper-Calvinist. So I don't think he's a hyper-Calvinist, but there are some things that he says that really make you wonder. So for instance, here's something that he says that makes you wonder. He says, this is a quote, "Speaking of the modern question, which has to do with hyper-Calvinism." Before I read this, let me give you a little definition of hyper-Calvinism. Hyper-Calvinism is basically the view, it's like a distorted view of the doctrine of election and predestination, and some of the other doctrines that go with it, like eternal justification and adoption. So that was kind of branded as the modern question. Is should or may Christian ministers and preachers offer the gospel to sinners? So typically I would define the modern question or hyper-Calvinism as a denial of the free offer of the gospel,
right,
and a denial of duty faith, that it is the duty of sinners to have faith in Christ.
Right.
So hyper-Calvinists would say that we may not offer grace. We may not offer the gospel to sinners because we don't know if they're elect or not. We have no biblical warrant to offer the gospel, or to especially the terminology of offer. They would also say it is not the duty of the non-elect to have faith. And again, they would have some quite sophisticated explanations about why and some theological rationale why. So here's Ryland on this. Speaking of the modern question, he says to Robert Hall, and he says Robert Hall Jr. and Andrew Fuller were busied on this question. The devil threw out an empty barrel for them to roll about, while they ought to have been drinking the wine of the kingdom. That old dog lying in the dark has drawn off many good men to whip syllabub and sift quiddities under the pretense of zeal for the truth. So in other words, Ryland is saying here, this whole question about hyper-Calvinism is it's all nonsense. It's a waste of time. It's whipping syllabub and sifting quiddities.
I'm going to incorporate those words into my vocabulary.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a great dig on somebody, just tell them they're whipping syllabub and sifting quiddities. And so he's basically saying, like, this is all just kind of a ridiculous conversation to have. So let me give you some examples of ways that he's not a hyper-Calvinist. He says explicitly that we should avoid two extremes. He says some high Calvinists neglect the unconverted, but Paul left no case untouched. He spoke properly and suitably to Felix as well as to Timothy. Some neglect to preach the law and tell their hearers to accept Christ. And then he says, "O sinners, beware. If Christ says depart, it's all over. Depart to 1,000 Etnas, bursting up forever and ever. Your souls are now within an inch of damnation. I am clear of your blood. If you are condemned, I will look you in the face on the day of judgment and say, Lord, I told that man, I told those boys and girls on the 29th of August, 1790, I warned them. They would not believe, and now they stand shivering before thy bar. So he was not hesitant at all to exhort sinners.
That sounds pretty
So you got some evidence in favor of him being a hyper-Calvinist, some evidence against. Here's a couple more. He was a huge fan of John Gill and John Brine and John Skep and Joseph Hussey. These were all of these were hyper-Calvinists. Some people debate about John Gill, and I'm sympathetic to that debate.
How dare you, sir?
I really am sympathetic, but there are some things about the theology of each of these men that are hyper-Calvinistic. So he's also super networked with non-hyper-Calvinists. We would call those evangelical Calvinists. Mm-hmm. So he was converted under the ministry of Benjamin Bedham, and he was trained at Bristol Academy. Both of those were kind of strongly influential in the evangelical Calvinistic world. He was a friend and supporter of George Whitefield and the revivals and awakenings. He was a friend of Newton and James Harvey. He reprinted the works of Edwards, or at least one sermon of Edwards. He was a super successful village preacher. He apparently introduced the gospel to more than 20 different villages. So he says that
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but for my listeners who may not be familiar, and frankly, me too, when you say a village preacher or like introduce the gospel to a village, what do you mean by that phrase?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So a lot of England was very rural and didn't have a lot of churches, and there weren't a lot of qualified ministers. So a lot of ministers kind of in slightly more urban areas would go out into these really kind of obscure and rural villages and preach almost kind of like revival services. And that was considered village preaching. And it was quite influential during the awakenings and kind of in the time that followed. And so
would we have expected those people in those villages to have heard the gospel before? Or is this something like, when you say introduce the gospel, is it many people would have never heard it who are in those villages because it's so rural and disjointed?
I don't know about never heard, like as in they were unreached or something like that, but it was more like they had very little access to gospel ministry, and so little access to preaching because there weren't qualified men to do it. And so some of these people would be like focused in different kinds of trades, like textile working and mining and agriculture and stuff like that, and probably wouldn't have prioritized time to go to church, or wouldn't have really had many church options at the time because of their location. So so he was basically kind of like a revival preacher, kind of as his side hustle in the villages. And so so one of the things about hyper-Calvinism is it has a tendency to shrink churches. When you talk about the gospel in this kind of way, and you're not strongly exhorting in your preaching, churches tended to shrivel and die. And you see that happen in the particular Baptist denomination during this time. But for Ryland's church, they had to expand his church building 3 times. Wow. And so, 2 times, twice enlarged. So there were 3 kind of iterations of his church. And so a lot of it was attributed to his preaching. And so it's really, I think really there's mixed evidence. I think the evidence leans away from Ryland being a hyper-Calvinist. And so he has a lot of wonderful things to say about zeal for the kingdom of God and zeal for doing everything in our power to save souls. And so it's really, when you read him in his own words, it's hard not to just to love him and give him the benefit of the doubt on this.
Yeah. I hear, I've been reading through John Flavel's works, just kind of devotionally. And one of the things you hear about him a lot is that a lot of his stuff is very pastoral, but some of it's kind of, it's not as, people will say it's not as like joyful for whatever reason, but I find that to be completely the opposite as I read them. You get into these guys, and if you can kind of read them in their own context and get a feel for who they are, and really dive into their works, and some of these Puritan authors that get a bad rap tend to be incredibly pastoral and just they get across a sense of joy that they have. So hopefully it's the same with J.C. Ryland here. So you mentioned one more. I do think we have time to cover. You were going to talk about ecclesiology a little bit, and then I have one question to ask you about his overall corpus. But go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of Ryland's ecclesiology, I think it's really quite amazing. So I mentioned he's a pastor in Northampton. I mentioned that Northamptonshire Baptist Association, where he has that kind of awkward interaction with William Carey somehow or another. One of the things that the Northamptonshire Baptist Association did was at their annual meeting, they would approve a letter to be sent out to the churches. And for quite a long stretch, they used that association letter to instruct the churches in sound doctrine. So in terms of theological connection, these churches would have kind of bound together. They would have been bound together on some common principles. They would have all confessed in some way or another. They would have affirmed the Second London Baptist Confession and the Baptist Catechism. And so John Ryland, so what they would do during these letters is different authors, different contributors would kind of write maybe like a short essay on different theological topics, and they would circulate those letters. And so John Ryland in 1777 writes the circular letter for the association on the topic of ecclesiology. And so it's called The Beauty of Social Religion. And so one of the things I love about his ecclesiology is he grounds his ecclesiology in this notion of spiritual friendship. And so what he says that spiritual friendship is the union of souls by a means of vital holiness, which is the common cement or bond of their mutual and ardent affection. So what he's saying is the thing that connects the local church together, that gives it its cohesion and warmth, is friendship. It's a spiritual friendship. It's not, we all have the same political opinions. It's not, we all are just rigidly adhering to a document. There's a spiritual and relational connection and commitment to one another that is kind of the fuel of our Christian activity and the glue of our Christian love. And so he kind of develops this letter under kind of some typical headings of, this is the nature and function of the church. These are the officers of the church. This is the kind of the role of what we do during worship. This is some stuff about the ordinances of the church, like baptism and the Lord's Supper. Then he has a section on the spirit and temper of a gospel church. And he basically goes into this sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. And it's just really quite amazing, some of the stuff he says about love. And I've just found this particular letter from him to be really fascinating, just to see how carefully and I guess passionately and relationally he talks about the church. It's not some cold dogmatic head of doctrine for him. It's about friendship. It's about commitment to relationship. And so I've just found it to be super fascinating just to think about what it would have been like to have read that and to have been part of this association.
Yeah, for sure. I think Dr. Haken actually just released a book, and you can go and find it. If you're listening, you can go and find it online, called Iron Sharpens Iron. Do you have it on the bookshelf? Look at that, sitting right there. Perfect. What is the subheader on that?
Yeah, friendship and the grace of God.
Yeah. So
he gives old John Collett Ryland a shout out in the intro of the book, I think.
Was that influenced by yourself?
I don't think so. Dr. Haken told me about Ryland. I don't tell him about Ryland.
Fair enough. You don't really tell Dr. Haken about anything, I don't think. He just instructs, which is great. Anyway, we're all Haken fans here. If you're a Baptist and you're not a Haken fan, go find out about Michael Haken. He's a good guy. I'm dying at some point. I have some connections with him. My father-in-law, who was on the very first episode of Regener8d Radio, you can go back and watch that. I feel like he is from Northern Ireland, and Dr. Haken being from that area as well, they're familiar with each other, and I need to use that connection to get him to come on and chat. But I haven't done that yet. So all right, well, so that sounds incredible, and I would have loved to have had that quote that you mentioned in the middle of that now I've already forgotten. But I was talking about friendship a couple of weeks ago, which I also have a video coming up pretty soon on that. It'll be one of the first standalone videos I've done. So if you guys are listening, check that out on the YouTube channel soon. So I was going to ask, after you got through the last one, the talking about hyper-Calvinism, the question struck me. If you had to recommend, if you can find, I mean, I know a lot of these are going to be harder to find works, but if you had to recommend one work of J.C. Ryland for somebody to read, what would it be?
So I mentioned that he's written literally thousands of pages.
Right.
There are so many good works. A lot of them are free online as scanned PDFs. If you go to like Google Books, you can find a bunch of stuff from him. That's how I've done a lot of my research. I will eventually need to go to London and like look in some archives for stuff that's not digitized, but I'm working on that. So if I were you and you're interested to read Ryland, I would look up his 1777 circular letter, The Beauty of Social Religion. If you just type in on Google Books, Beauty of Social Religion, you'll eventually find it. Another good one to start with is his sermon that he gave called The Wise Student and Christian Preacher, which is just such a fascinating kind of sermon he gave at, I think it was a meeting of the Bristol Education Society. But I'm telling you, I read that, and it was one of the most fascinating things that I've read from him. Just seeing his heart. He mentions John Flavel in there a little bit in a footnote. He's talking about what it means to be a faithful gospel preacher, and he's basically describing George Whitefield. At some point, he says something about Whitefield. He actually confirms it in a letter to somewhere else to James Hervey in a previous letter early in his life that he was going to write one day a long essay on what an ideal preacher is like, and it was going to be basically a description of George Whitefield. So that's ultimately what ends up happening there. I think it's in 1780. So one of his bigger things that I would recommend, this is probably where I'm going to do a lot of my particular focus. He's got a 500-page book on the divinity of Christ.
Wow.
That has basically never been analyzed as far as I know. I've never seen anybody interact with it. It is absolutely fascinating. The first several chapters of the book are about ways that Christ appears in the Old Testament and the proving the divinity of Christ from his from the whole of the Old Testament. Then it's got a section about the perfections of Christ, and then it's got several sections about just different applications and proofs of the divinity of Christ. It's super interesting, and that'll probably be a big part of some of my academic work.
That sounds like a really fun read, though. I mean, if there's nothing that gets me kind of fired up about the faith more, it's reading Christology, and that sounds could be really cool to get a hold of. Well, that sounds great. Okay, so a couple of kind of questions just to sort of land the plane here, I guess, a little bit. Why should we care about John Ryland today? Why? I mean, you're doing your entire doctoral research on this man. Why? Like, what do we have to learn from him that we should really be able to apply in the church setting today?
Yeah, so I think maybe in the big picture, we should view the study of history as an act of love. We should care about figures like John Ryland as an application of Jesus' second greatest command to love your neighbor as yourself. We have contemporary neighbors who are separated from us by space and by maybe cultural differences. But we also have neighbors, and these are brothers and sisters in the faith who are separated from us by time. In this situation, 300 years of time. And so they need our care and attention, and they have something to teach us. And so I think as an act of love, we engage with them. Historical study, when it's done with integrity and precision, is a kind of loving your neighbor as you seek to understand them in their own words for what they're truly saying. But if you're a Baptist, there's even more incentive for studying some of these figures. We need to recover our own theology. Amen. And this is happening through this big resurgence of kind of confessional thinking. Mm-hmm. But Baptists need to recover our own theology. A lot of times when Baptists start to get serious about theology, they think they need to go to the Presbyterians. They think they need to go to the Anglicans or to the nonconformist Puritans or whatever, mm-hmm. Or conformist Puritans. And so there's a rich legacy and history of Baptist theology. We don't have to go outside. We can stay inside the Baptist tradition and have tons of resources for our own theology. So I see the recovery of Baptist theology happening, in a lot of circles, in a lot of our circles. But I think a part of recovering Baptist theology is recovering Baptist history.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to know the history so that you can situate the theology that you're recovering. So the theology doesn't just appear in a vacuum. There are lines of historical development and interpersonal relationships and this kind of brotherly love. And also there's conflict and breakups that happen too. So we need the history of the Baptist tradition in order to properly understand the theology, or else we're really fooling ourselves that we're actually recovering the theology. So we need history for the sake of the theology, because the definitions of terms evolve over time. You can read people like John Owen or Bunyan or Gill or Ryland. You can read into their works anything you want if you're not careful about the history, and you can ultimately abuse their writings unless you have some historical awareness. So if you're a Baptist, I want you to learn your own history. If you're academically minded, you should find a way to dig into some of these marginal figures, even if it's just like a side interest for you. And you're going to be blessed, and other people are going to be helped. And at the end of the day, if Baptists don't write our own history, if we don't study our own history and articulate our own theology, nobody will, or else they're going to do it badly. And there's just so much uncharted territory in Baptist studies. That's ultimately why I focused on what I'm focusing on. When I started off in my interest in doctoral studies, I was pretty sure I wanted to do the early church fathers. I was going to try to be a patristics guy. I had this phone conversation with Dr. Haken, and he basically said everybody has access or can have a claim on the church fathers: Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants. It's fair game for every tradition.
Right.
Nobody is fighting to talk about Baptist history.
Yeah.
And it's basically it's an open field for study. And so if we don't write about Baptist history and if we don't uncover this stuff from these archives, nobody will. And so I want to encourage you, if you're into that, please join me.
Well, no,
it's a family history.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I mean, I can look at my shelf and I can see right here, over here somewhere, the works of John Owen. I've got Flavel, I've got Matthew Henry, I've got all of these people, Turretin up there, John Murray. What did you say? Presbyterians for the most part, right?
Yeah,
all these people.
Mostly Presbyterians. Yeah,
and I love them, and they did so much to develop the theology that we subscribe to. But I have my two shelves up here of Spurgeon, which I love, and that's really helpful as well. But Spurgeon is pretty much the figure that everyone has studied. We know most of what we can find out probably at this point about Charles Haddon Spurgeon. We don't know much about J.C. Ryland, and I would love to see more works coming out like that as well. And that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to do this Baptist Profiles series of episodes, and it may be kind of sporadic, but if nothing else, it's hopefully we'll get someone out there interested in some historical figure. I know what you mentioned before. There was a really great Facebook post by Michael Haken that talked about how Baptist history is just wide open right now, and there's so much material. That's what worried me at first. If I was going to be looking at Baptist history and historical figures, well, where am I going to find? There can't be that many resources about them if we don't have that much stuff already, and that's just not true. Apparently, there's tons of primary sources that have just never even been touched, and I think we need to dive into those as Baptists more. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in here, but do you have any other thoughts to kind of wrap us up here?
Yeah. So one thing I love to consider when I'm talking about history is what does this have to do with the church today? Kind of related to the last question, like why should we care about Ryland? What could he possibly teach the church today? And so I think the thing that I'm seeing right now in my study about Ryland is the importance of humility. So this is more just thinking about his legacy. Ryland was a really big deal in his day. He was really well known. He came from a great family. His son was super influential in the formation of the Baptist Missionary Society. But within just a generation or two, nobody is talking about John Collett Ryland. They weren't talking about him. They weren't reading any of the thousands of pages that he wrote and spent himself into financial ruin in order to produce. Nobody was talking about him or reading him at all. So here we are. We're standing in his tradition with resources at just the ends of our fingers on our keyboards, and none of us has even heard his name. And it's the question is like, is it just meaningless? Was his a wasted life? And I say no. I think about a passage like Acts 13:36. It says, for David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep and was laid into his fathers and saw corruption. I think we need to ask ourselves, are you okay with that? He served God in his generation. He fell asleep. He was laid with his fathers and he saw corruption. Are you okay with kind of a local ministry? Not everybody is going to have their name remembered down the centuries and millennia. So I think we need to ask ourselves, could we have the humility to be okay with being a relatively marginal figure, but faithful in our generation? I think if you're aiming higher than that, trying to make a name for yourself, ironically, I think you're falling short of God's purpose for you. And so I think we can learn humility, because as big a deal as Ryland was in his day, again, he was faithful in his generation, and that was enough. Maybe another thing that we can learn about Ryland is the value of the life of the mind. He was extraordinary in his ministry in the church. He produced all this material. A big part of his bivocational ministry was he started a school for young boys. And so it would probably be something like our equivalent of kind of middle school and high school boys. And he had 3 different schools, and all of them were super successful. He was super committed to passing on the truths of the gospel to the next generation. He's out there republishing the works of Isaac Newton. He's publishing geography materials. He's publishing Greek and Hebrew grammars and other kinds of historical writings. I mentioned the works of the Sermons of Edwards. He translated for the first time into English a Latin text of John Owen on divine justice. Wow. So he's really active as a thinker. He's engaging with deism in his time. He's defending the deity of Christ in his day. He's totally committed to educating youth in the culture. And so I think those 2 things in particular, not to mention just the content of his material, like the content itself is wonderful. But those are kind of 2 kind of overarching lessons that I'm learning from Ryland as I'm studying.
Yeah. I think that's I love that idea of just being okay with obscurity. You know, I think I told you this a while back, but I would love nothing. And despite the fact that I'm doing this fancy podcast and I'm, trying to market it and trying to make sure that it reaches some people and people are actually benefiting from it. Despite all that, I would love nothing more than to, when I'm finished with seminary, take a pastorate in a rural church somewhere that we can be taken care of and, just devote life to shepherding sheep there and writing or doing whatever else the case may be. More of this maybe, but regardless, I think that that's important, and I do think that that's the right attitude. And I this is maybe going off on a bit of a tangent, but I see not so much in the circles that you and I run in, but in the circles that I and some of the people watching right now, I see there in the chat run in. We see a lot of people who try to use, quite frankly, try to use their faith as a platform for themselves rather than platforming Christ. And I think that's just the exact opposite of what you get from figures like J.C. Ryland and many other figures in Baptist history and just church history in general. They're not there to lift up their name or try to make a name for themselves. If they're remembered, it's because they were faithful and plodding. Right? That's the William Carey thing. I can plod. Just make it happen, and then it comes with that, and that's great. But it's not the works of the man; it's the works of Christ and His church. So I think it's really important for us to keep in mind. Well, okay, Garrett, I really appreciate that. That was a really good way of rounding it out too. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just give us a few quick plugs before we close out? Where can we find you online, and where can we find any of your writings and things like that? Obviously, we've mentioned London Lyceum, but anywhere else?
Yeah, so if you're interested in Ryland or anything about Ryland, reach out to me. I will be happy to encourage you, and I can send you material to start reading and working on. You can find me at the London Lyceum website. There's a place you can find me there, and my contact info. It's really just I think it's just a link to my Twitter account, and so you can find me on Twitter. That's probably the best place to communicate with me. You can send me a direct message there. My email address is just my Twitter handle at gmail.com. So please do reach out to me. I'd love to love to encourage you in Baptist history. I can't promise I've got all the answers. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, I'm a student. I'm a historian in training.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have like perfect knowledge, and I don't have the complete picture yet at this point. I may not ever have that complete picture. So I'm happy to just join with you arm in arm and learn about Baptist history, learn our own theology.
All right. Well, sounds great. Garrett, would you mind praying for us as we close out?
Yeah, absolutely. Our Father in heaven, we do thank you for your goodness. We thank you for the rich legacy that we have in the tradition of our faith. We are grateful that we don't come at our lives apart from your revealed word and apart from your beloved people. So God, I pray that you would help us to be, as we're seeking to be faithful students of the past, that we would be reminded that you provide for all of our needs. You guide us in all of our steps. Lord, you've given us the light of your word, and you've given us the company of your people. And thank you for men like John Collett Ryland and how he was faithful in his generation. God, I pray that you would use all of my efforts and all of Gregg's efforts and the ministries that we're involved in to help us to be faithful in our generation, and that we would be pleasing in your sight, that your church would be built up, and that Christ would receive all the glory. And that we ask this in his name. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, Garrett, we appreciate you coming on. For you guys who are watching, thank you for watching. And again, if you are waiting for the audio of this will be up pretty soon, probably tomorrow or Friday. And so just be on the lookout for, or I guess that tomorrow is Wednesday, so tomorrow sometime in the next few days. So check out the audio on Spotify, share with your friends. I think this is going to be a really fun series as we go forward. And if you have any any recommendations about people, even Baptist figures in history that you'd like to hear about, I'm more than happy to field those and see if we can lay out the groundwork. I've got a few people lined up for it already, but I think it'll be a lot of fun.